I live at the Loretto Mother House, and my international experiences, I started in Bolivia, working with the Mennonite Central Committee, and spent 2 or 3 years there, and then went to El Salvador, and it's in El Salvador where I learned to know Ann Manganero, who got me into the Loretto community. And then from El Salvador, I moved to Nicaragua. So that was about a total of about 20 or 21 years that I was in Latin America.
I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm an occupational therapist. And it was when I was in the novitiate at the Mother House that I felt very compelled to go to Vietnam, because I was aware of U.S. involvement and the horrible reality of that war, and began looking at doing that, and decided not to do that after talking with a lot of people, because Americans were no longer wanted there unless you spoke the language and had a medical skill, which I didn't. And so by virtue of that, I ended up looking at medical skills and became an occupational therapist. And then in 1980, when the 4 U.S. women were murdered in El Salvador, I and so many of the rest of us were very stunned by that experience, and knew right away that could have been me, that could have been another sister friend of mine, and identified very much with the reality of that happening in El Salvador. And just this morning I was reading in Naming Our Truth, the chapter about our history in Latin America, and the amazing evolution of those 20 years between the Second Vatican Council and then our going to El Salvador with the Mothers of the Disappeared at the invitation of these women. And it was at that trip, it was only 3 days, and there were 35 of us, that I just sort of, in a way, fell in love with the people of El Salvador and was very drawn to their struggle. And so went on accompaniment trips several times between 80 and 89 when I went back. And I went back to join Ann Manganero, Sister Loretto, who left in 88 to go there to be a doctor with the refugees in El Salvador. The reason I was able to go in 80 with the delegation of church women to El Salvador was because Marian McAvoy asked me to do that kind of at the last minute. And that was a great story of where I said to her, I think there are more people more qualified and more deserving of making this trip than myself. And she said, of course there are, but I don't have time to find them. We need to give them a name tomorrow. Do you want to go or don't you? It was like a life-changing event for me. So that was like Loretto right in my face.
For me, it was different because I was already in El Salvador when I became acquainted with Loretto. So Loretto didn't inspire me to go to Central America, but I definitely feel grateful because Loretto helped me get in touch with a deeper sense of spirituality that allowed me to continue in Central America. Because experiences there really brought me to the end of some of my own understanding of what I think now of as a theology of service, and through Loretto and time here at the Mother House for my own personal healing, I was introduced into spirituality, and that then helped me learn how to sustain myself in some of those difficult situations. Well, not even sustain myself, receive the sustaining from a deeper spirit that I needed.
I think that whole reality of learning and growing in ways you don't anticipate is kind of at the core of my Salvador experience, because I thought I was going for one thing maybe, but for me it was an invitation of the people of El Salvador first to accompany them. And there's something about the notion of accompaniment that has become very important to me in terms of kind of service and community. And so when Anne chose to go to Salvador, she was looking at lots of different countries. I wanted to go to Salvador for a longer period of time also, but in a sense I didn't have the, I don't know, maybe courage or inner strength to do that by myself. And so when Anne was going, that was a perfect invitation to me to go and spend longer time there. And I think as I have looked back on it, the whole thing was about accompaniment. When I was with Anne, it was really not only accompaniment with the people of El Salvador who wanted international people to be with them in this struggling time, but it was accompaniment for Anne during that time in her life. And that's not what I thought my service would be, but I think that's what it was.
Martha, I really identify as well with accompaniment. You know, my friends and neighbors in El Salvador knew better than I did that I couldn't solve their problems, and they weren't looking to me to do that. Although I put a lot of that pressure on myself, unsuccessfully, of course. but what they were looking for was, and we talked about it a lot in English and in Spanish, to accompany people in their own journey towards healing and transformation and social change. And that was one piece that I really started to identify with Loretto, that whole sense of Friends of Mary at the foot of the cross, and that presence with suffering that has become very meaningful to me. Is that something that you identify with, Martha?
Yes, I think so. And just that real sense from the people of El Salvador. I don't know about other people in other places where Loretto people have been, but that sense of welcoming and wanting us to simply be with them was what they wanted. And it's about community. It's about, it was about for them the importance also of us being with them, but also taking back the message to the United States of what our government was doing there, and to tell the story about them. So that was another important piece, I think, from where the people were and what they asked of us.
This is kind of going back to some of my own spirituality and Loretto, but I remember the first time I read in I Am the Way, the part about Friends of Mary at the foot of the cross, and the sense of accompanying people who are suffering, and at that point I was reading about God's suffering, and Salvadoran people's that strong liberation theology, awareness of God hearing the cry of the poor, and that for me has been life-changing, because at the same time that, there are these very difficult experiences, and that's what makes the headlines, and the people we were with, I mean, they knew how to have fun, and that's a lot to put together. It's stretching in a very positive way. To later, I found a quote from the prophet where Gibran talks about it's when sorrow carves a space into our being, there's more room for joy. Mm-hmm. And that was my experience through those people that I lived with.
I think for me too, it was a kind of stretching. And one of the things I alluded to in that chapter in Naming Our Truth was one time when I was there with Kit Kincannon, a sister of Loretto, before Anne went. We were in a house, and we got kind of trapped in there because of fighting and bombing around us. And I had this realization that I couldn't get out. But in a bigger sense, I realized there's no going back. There's no turning around now. There's only going forward and staying with a choice that I made, and trusting that, trusting or not, there was no going back. And I think for me spiritually, that realization that once your heart has expanded and you take a step, you take the next one. It grew exponentially. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how much I knew about solidarity before El Salvador, but those people taught me so much, as did friends in the States who would write to me and kind of keep me as strong as I could be in a situation where I was really pretty frightened and feeling pretty inept for a lot of that time. I think, and that goes back to the accompaniment. I think the solidarity is right there along with the accompaniment. And it's been very clear to me, certainly since Salvador, and maybe before that not only can I not do much at all alone, but I don't want to. I really want the community and the solidarity and the accompaniment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm like Martha in that I personally identify more with accompaniment than solidarity. Accompaniment was the term that we used in the circles that I lived and worked with in Central America. I always considered solidarity to be more of a North American word. With the people that I worked with, both the organization and others that I worked with, that I'm a nurse by training, and I trained health workers. So, I mean, that was something that was needed. I did that. But in kind of our starkest way of describing our work was basically a legitimate excuse that allowed us to be there, because the very fundamental reason for our presence was presence. Mm-hmm. To be a witness, to get word out to the broader world about what was happening there, to be a compassionate, loving presence in whatever way that we could.
I had a thought when Susan was talking that doesn't particularly relate to that, but it relates to, I think, a skill that if I didn't learn it in Salvador, I honed it there. And that is being able to relate to individuals personally in a tough situation. For example, when we would try to get through the military checkpoints to get back to where we needed to be, Anne would always carry something like gum or chips, some little package of something, and these young people this is simplifying it a little bit, but relating to the young men who were at the checkpoints and chatting with them and offering them something would sometimes get us through into places we weren't supposed to be. And I think there are many times when relating to people individually and as a person, instead of the difficulty of getting stuck in the political dangerous war reality, was very, very helpful.
I want to pick up what you're saying, Martha, in the sense of relating to people, and go back to the concept of mission. You know, at least, I mean, I think we can have a tendency to think of mission as we go some other place and we help people who have need, you know, and that's a position of power. You know, I've got the help, they've got the need, and I'll share it. And so many people, when I was in El Salvador, when I'd come back to the U.S., you know, they would think that I was really doing something that they couldn't possibly do, and that it was a special mission that I was involved with, when in reality, on a daily level, I mean, I was living my life among my friends, just as anybody, any place lives their life among their friends. And that, what Martha was saying about relating, you know, to not see the soldiers as enemies, to know the soldiers in El Salvador for who they were, which was, I mean, most of them were young peasant boys that were conscripted into the army and belittled and made fun of until they could be mean when they needed to be. And so to relate to them as human beings, and if I take that now, you know, even to our current political situation and how I am or talk about with people in politics that I strongly disagree with, or my neighbor or a community member, you know, can I relate to them at the core of who they are? And to me, that is a growing edge of what I consider to be a lived expression of mission.
I want to say there in response to you, Susan, that Susan and I, by the way, crossed paths in El Salvador. She was there when I was there, and the whole notion of missionary, I think I put this in Naming Our Truths. Being in Salvador was extremely difficult to me. I was excited about going, looking forward to it. I thought I would be there for a year. I had a time parameter on it. I wanted to be, quote, successful. I wanted to be helpful. I wanted to do a job. And none of that came to fruition in my mind. I was there for, I think, about maybe 5 months, and realized during that 5th month that, and Susan and Anne and other friends Kathy Arata were very helpful at helping me see that it was really time for me to go home. The physical stress, I mean, the physical reality, I had physical symptoms of stress that I couldn't overcome there, and finally realized I was no missionary, and neither were any of my friends, but that notion was not one we owned. But I realized I simply couldn't do it, and felt like a real failure that I couldn't stay for 12 months. Now, with perspective, that's a kind of silly thing to expect of yourself, but we have those expectations of ourselves, and we fail, and I fail, and we're going to fail. And years after I got home, a sister from a different community, which community, in northern Colorado, invited me to come and talk to a group of returned missionaries. They were called returned missionaries, and they were in a program for getting back into the U.S. culture after being away for so long. And so I went and I told them my story of feeling like I was not a returned missionary, never was a missionary, and how hard it was for me to come to the reality of leaving. And after that was over, it was Mary Alice Murphy.
Oh, sure.
So when it was over, she said to me, I can't tell you how helpful your sharing was, because this happened to people all the time who go and sort of don't make it and come back. So that was kind of cool. Like I got to use that experience that I had always judged as a failure that was kind of helpful to other people. And so I was happy to hear that. And that was a lot for me to grow into and out of. And I wouldn't trade those months in Salvador for anything, for many reasons. One of the things that was part and parcel of going to Central America during those years from 80 to 89, when I went and came back several times, was the task of doing a lot of teaching when we came back at just different church groups, various groups, maybe other communities, to talk about what the U.S. was doing. Yeah, now you go, Susan. About in terms of Loretto, precisely. Yeah.
I think of it whenever and however we really get stretched out of our comfort zone, we change, and that changes whoever and whatever is around us. And I mean, I really relate to images, so I think about it. If I have a glass of water and add a few grains of salt, a few grains of salt, they're not going to make the water salty, but they do immediately change the chemical composition of the whole glass of water. And when I think of community and each member of the community living out of her or his passion in a significant way, and so committed to that it really forces us to grow and change, then that has to impact the community. And I mean, how it does, I can't identify, but it does. I'm remembering a person who was on a delegation that I was helping with, and he was someone who was from the U.S. He was very resistant the whole 2 weeks he was there, and at the closing reflection, he broke into tears and he said, "I feel like a puzzle that has just been thrown up in the air and all of the pieces are scattered." Not everyone necessarily experiences it that dramatically, but living life from a radically different place and different perspective, it stretches us beyond the explanations or the assumptions or the perspectives that we've had. And we learn that there's lots of different ways to live life, and lots of different circumstances in which people are struggling and finding great satisfaction and happiness in their lives beyond what many people in the US experience, you know? So it raises so many questions. And whenever questions are raised and followed, you know, when we're following questions, and that's what I feel like my time in Latin America planted some really deep life questions that don't have answers, but they just keep me seeking.
And I think the richness of the exposure to the big picture, politically and economically, and also all the personal growth that has to happen with each individual who goes and comes, is as rich as it can be, and that enhances the richness of the whole in so many ways. It expands our minds and hearts, and
I'm sitting here thinking, you know, I went to Latin America when I was 23, and I came back to live I came back to the US to live when I was 45. So those years, I mean, I was there long enough that I was just living my life. I just wasn't living it in the US. So that dailiness of life experience has stayed with me. It's not like I was on an international experience and then came back. And I say that in terms of how I see Loretto living beyond borders, because to me, the real challenge is to recognize how my daily life is already connected beyond borders. You know, every time I get dressed, I'm clothed in the reality that our lives are lived beyond the borders. And I so appreciate Cecily Jones and her poems, because they connect very clearly the reality of how our lives are touched. Like her poem about the fire in the sweatshop in Bangladesh that killed 1,139 workers, you know, or the women who carry cargo on their backs in Morocco. Those are glimpses to me of beyond borders. You know, every time I put gas in my car, I'm living beyond my borders of assumptions about time and Earth's resources. You know, every time I put gas in my car, I'm using a gift of fossil fuels that's over 350 million years old. You know, what if I could live beyond the borders of how I define time, you know, or how I define what is my right to use? So, I mean, those are, and once I started thinking of borders that way, I mean, I could go on and on and on beyond the borders of our theologies and into the depths of the reality of different faith traditions. I mean, there's so many borders we are being challenged, I think, to live beyond.
Yeah, Susan, that last thing you said, the challenge, I don't have a very finished kind of answer to that. But as I read the question and thought about it earlier, it's clear that borders are arbitrary and changing all the time. And it seems to me one of our tasks as a community of faith who believe in the mystery of the sacred is to always be on the edge of a border or a boundary and see beyond. And I think the third world experience, as we used to call it, or international experiences that we're talking about now are important for that. But I also think sometimes what's happening right now in the community in terms of the institutional church is also a border and a boundary. And I just want us always to try to be consistent at helping one another pay attention to living on an edge and being able to look both ways before we take a step, or to take a step and then realize that it was the Spirit that helped us take that risk of moving beyond the border, or something old that used to be a boundary that shouldn't be a boundary anymore. The whole notion of, this is a bit wandering in thought, but the whole notion of race, humans being different races, it's simply not true. There's no such thing as race. We are all from the same cell. And so what do I mean by that? I don't know. Let's stop it there.
I want to say one more thing about beyond the borders of how we understand mission, because to me that's a real growing edge for us. I mean, mission is the very heart of who we are as a community, and so how we understand that as we change and as the world changes, what we're being invited to, and this is it's a small example. You know, I already. Well, it's just an example. In my community group, recently we had a conversation about Loretto, and we started talking about coffee, and we were aware that it would seem quite natural for Loretto to financially support, let's say, a coffee co-op in Central America. That would feel like mission to us. We're supporting a coffee co-op. But then we said, well, so why don't we drink fair trade coffee to support the coffee co-op? Well, no, it's too expensive. You know, we bring that mindset of mission is out there, and we'll use our money to provide support to the co-op, but it would be extravagant to spend all that money to buy fair trade coffee. So, I mean, that's just an example of what I think is true in lots of ways. And, you know, I find myself in it as well, where I still have kind of dual standards, and I don't have a very clear awareness yet of what I feel like is a real needed paradigm shift. And I really appreciate an author, Samuel Avery, has named this in a book called The Pipeline and the Paradigm, where he talks about we have to shift from an economic paradigm to an ecologic paradigm. You know, in the current economic paradigm, everything is seen through the lens of money, and Earth, it's raw materials to make more money. That's not sustainable, and we know it, you know, and so for ourselves to really shift into an ecological paradigm that includes money. I mean, it's not that we don't need money, but that's it's the living world that life forms around from an ecologic paradigm, not money at the center. So, you know, when I think about climate change, when I think about the suffering of people from injustice, and mean, so many root causes of the suffering come from that kind of worldview. And if we could be, like Martha said, kind of pushing the edge of living into a very different way of perceiving ourselves in the world, I mean, what a mission.
Mm-hmm. As you're saying that, Susan, I'm appreciating so much your ability to articulate that and realizing how important each one of us is to the other in terms of some of us can say it well, some of us can do other things well, and I think the whole notion of community and managing in these times we're living in is so crucial, and I'm sure has always been crucial to any time. But I just value the treasure of community, and I also want to say that I am sitting here thinking of P.J. Mannion and her contribution to the community as she is now sort of finishing out her life in a way that she wouldn't have chosen. And I just want to say thank you to her for getting these books done, for getting this information down. One of the last things she said to me when I was visiting her in May at the Mother House, and she didn't say very many sentences, but she did say, "Who's going to write it down?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "PJ, do you mean who's going to write down what's going on with you right now?" And she said, "Yes, but I think she meant something bigger than that." And then I said, "I will try to write it down." And she said, "Where will we start?" Mm-hmm.